Hey guys, tonight we uncover one of the darkest and most tragic secrets hidden deep within royal history. A time when pure bloodlines were guarded above all else. But the cost was a horror no one dared to speak of. This story isn't whispered just once in a palace hallway. It echoed through generations. Behind gilded walls and velvet curtains, a queen gave birth to a nightmare that would haunt her dynasty forever. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's incredible how far these silent stories travel across time and space. If you appreciate these slow, forgotten histories, make sure to subscribe. You're always welcome here. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or some soft background noise. And let's begin. Yuri standing in a grand, shadowed royal chamber. A secret hangs heavy in the air. And history is about to reveal its darkest truth. It begins not with a trumpet or a feast, but with a muffled cry in a candlelit room. Somewhere behind thick stone walls, far from the castle halls or crowded village lanes, a child is being born. The year is uncertain. It could be 1172, or 1349, or 1421, for in truth, the experience changed little over centuries. And wherever it happened, for most children in the Middle Ages, life began in quiet shadows. In a cramped, smoky chamber, where warmth was a struggle and death never far from the door. There is a midwife present, perhaps two. Their hands are calloused, practiced. They do not panic. The woman giving birth may be a peasant in a timber cottage, or a noblewoman lying beneath woven tapestries, but she grips the edge of her bedding the same. She gasps in pain just as her mother once did. There is water boiled in a kettle, a stack of coarse linen cloths, and herbs burning to mask the scent. And then, a wet cry. A shriek too small for the world it enters. The midwife holds the child up to the dim firelight. If it is breathing, she mutters a blessing. If not, she works quickly. For in these moments, no rank or wealth can shield one from fate. A child who does not cry may not be long for this world. Most births were home births. Hospitals were rare, and often more dangerous than helpful. Church-run infirmaries existed, but were mostly for the dying, not the birthing. Even noblewomen bore children at home, attended by a chambermaid, perhaps a physician if they could afford one. Yet the midwife was the constant figure, part healer, part wise woman, part priestess of a private ritual. She had seen many babies born, and she had buried more than she could count. The risk of death was not reserved for the infant. Mothers died frequently. Hemorrhage, infection, breech births, each carried brutal danger. For every 100 births, an estimated 5 to 10 women did not survive. The Church, meanwhile, taught that childbirth was punishment for Eve's sin. So suffering was expected. Holy even. It was rare for a woman to scream without shame, and rarer still for anyone to listen. Yet in those first hours after birth, something softer often took root. If the baby lived, it was swaddled tightly, arms pinned at its sides, wrapped in linen to keep the limbs straight. The medieval mind feared crookedness, both physical and moral. A tightly wrapped baby was thought to grow up more obedient. The bundle was then laid in a wooden cradle, perhaps near the hearth or by the mother's bedside. If the mother had died, another woman might nurse the child. A wet nurse, if the family was wealthy. A neighbor or relative, if not. And what of the father? That depended. Among peasants, the father was often present, helping the midwife, fetching water, or simply waiting outside. Among nobles, he might not see the child for days. The birth of a son brought celebration, inheritance, and prayers of thanks. A daughter brought silence, or sometimes shame. For though girls were beloved within families, the world beyond did not value them the same. In some records, daughters are not even named. But let us stay a moment longer in this quiet room. The child, red and wrinkled, lies sleeping in a cradle smeared with honey or ashes to keep insects away. A cat watches from the corner. The mother, pale but alive, holds her hand over her stomach and whispers a prayer of thanks. The fire crackles. Outside, rain falls gently on the thatched roof. And somewhere, a church bell tolls the hour. This infant is not yet baptized, but that will happen soon. The Church insisted on baptism within days of birth, sometimes within hours, for fear the soul might be lost if death came too soon. Babies were taken to the parish font, even in storms. Midwives were granted emergency rights to baptize if the child seemed close to death. Water, salt, oil, the naming of the child, the marking of the cross. These were the first rites of life, and the first shield against demons and damnation. Still, infant mortality was staggering. Between a third and half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Illness, starvation, cold, or simple accident, the dangers were endless. A bad winter could wipe out entire village nurseries. And yet medieval people loved their children fiercely. Archaeological graves show tiny skeletons buried with care, cradled with dolls, spoons, tokens. Parents wept. Mothers carved prayers into pews. Fathers built tiny crosses from scraps of wood. The lullabies of the time, preserved in crumbling manuscripts, speak not of fairy queens or sugar plums, but of protection. Sleep, little one chant goes, lest the wolf come, lest fever burn. Another, angels guard thy cradle, stay thy breath from harm. These were not whimsical songs. They were shields of rhythm, armor of repetition. A way to ward off fate through hope. At the heart of all this was the bond between mother and child. Breastfeeding lasted as long as 3 years. Weaning was slow. There were no bottles, no formula. Just the body, weary, aching, faithful. If a woman could not nurse, and no wet nurse was found, the child's chances dimmed sharply. Some were fed animal milk from horns or soaked bread. Others simply faded. But not all stories end in sorrow. Many children did survive. And their earliest days, filled with cradle songs, soft cloth, the warmth of a mother's skin, laid the foundation for life in a harsh world. They did not yet know toil, or hunger, or fear. For a brief time, they belonged only to sleep, and warmth, and the hush of their mother's breath. So let us stay here just a moment longer, in this room where a life has begun. Outside, the world will come soon enough. There will be chores and fevers, play and prayer, tears and training. But tonight, a child has entered the world. And the first sound it hears is love. Now dim the lights. Let the day soften behind you. If you're still awake, you might feel your own heartbeat slow, as if in rhythm with something much older than you. The hush of a cradle. The echo of a lullaby. Welcome to the world of medieval childhood. And welcome back to the quiet side of history. In a quiet hamlet tucked beneath the rising fog of early morning, the village bell begins to toll. The hour is just after dawn. Chickens peck at cold earth, a dog yawns on the steps of a stone cottage, and through the crisp air comes the slow trudge of tiny feet. Children, wrapped in wool cloaks far too large for their shoulders, are beginning their walk to the village schoolhouse, a place that is more myth than memory for many, a space not of joy, but of duty, dread, or longing. Education in the medieval world was not guaranteed. In truth, it was a privilege few could afford and even fewer could attend. And yet, the notion of learning, of letters, of God, of station, lingered in the air like the morning frost, just out of reach for so many. Inside the schoolhouse, if there was one at all, the space was simple. Wooden benches lined up in rows, a slate or tablet propped on a ledge, and at the front, the stern figure of the master. He might be a monk, or an elderly clerk from the local manor. His robes smelled faintly of old ink and ashes. A birch rod leaned quietly in the corner, not always used, but always seen. Discipline was as present as dust. There were no textbooks, no colorful charts, no idle chattering. Lessons were often given aloud, to be memorized, repeated, absorbed through recitation and correction. The alphabet, the paternoster, perhaps some Latin, these were the roots of knowledge, planted slowly in the minds of those lucky enough to sit upon those benches. But most children were never there. Instead, they were in fields, herding sheep. In kitchens, turning spits. In smithies, blowing bellows. Learning did not mean ink and parchment for the majority. It meant skill and repetition, the passing of tasks from one hand to another. A child learned to spin because her mother placed flax in her palms before she could tie her own shoes. A boy learned to stitch leather because his uncle gave him a torn pouch and a blunt awl, and said, "Mend it." Apprenticeship, not academia, was the schoolroom of the rural child. Still, there were places where the world of books did shimmering to view. Monastic schools, quiet, echoing spaces behind cloistered walls, sometimes welcomed children, though usually boys, and usually those from noble or clerical families. The days were structured around the divine office: prayers at dawn, lessons by mid-morning, more prayers by noon. They learned to read in Latin before their own native tongue. They copied pages of psalms onto wax tablets, dipped pens in iron gall ink, and whispered their chants beneath candlelight. But even here, the pressure was enormous. To fail to memorize a verse might mean a sleepless night, or a harsh word. The education was not always gentle, but it was a door to a different world. And what of girls? A question often lost in medieval scrolls. Formal schooling for girls was rare, but not unheard of. In some nunneries, daughters of nobility were taught to read prayers, manage household accounts, even write letters. These places were not just religious retreats, they were hubs of female literacy, however limited. But outside these walls, most girls learned through observation, watching their mothers balance accounts at the manor, hearing their grandmothers recite old rhymes and herbal remedies. Their knowledge was practical: how to preserve meat, how to judge cloth, how to manage a household with barely a penny to spare. For children of the peasantry, the rhythms of life were determined by necessity, not nurture. At 7 or 8, a child might already be entrusted with vital tasks. A boy could be driving geese to pasture. A girl might be left with 2 younger siblings while her mother hauled water from the stream. Their play, when it existed, was woven in with chores: a game of counting stones while fetching firewood, a race while delivering bread. They learned through doing, because they had to. Some manor houses and towns offered a different path. Guilds, especially in larger cities, began to formalize apprenticeships. A boy might be sent to live with a carpenter or baker, not just to learn a trade, but to be molded into a future citizen, bound by rules, expectations, and the values of the craft. These apprenticeships were long. 7 years was common. The child became part of another household, often with no contact with his parents for months, even years. He rose early, worked hard, and only at the very end might he dream of becoming a journeyman. It was a path, yes, but a narrow, unyielding one. And what of those who never entered a school, nor served a guild, nor joined the monastery? They, too, had knowledge. The kind passed around a hearth, not between book covers. They knew the weather by the smell of the wind. They could tell which berries were safe, which mushrooms deadly. They could sing the ballads of their ancestors and tell stories that explained the stars. Their education was unrecorded, but not unimportant. The line between child and adult in medieval life was thinner than we imagine. By 12 or 13, a boy might be helping with the plow. A girl might be betrothed. Some were already married. Others were in service. Childhood ended not with a birthday, but with burden. The moment a child could work like an adult, they were treated like one. There was little space for adolescence, little patience for rebellion. You grew up because you must. But within these constraints, moments of play did exist. Children chased hoops, balanced on fences, carved toys from scraps of wood. In winter, they slid across frozen streams. In summer, they caught frogs and beetles. Medieval art sometimes shows these scenes, of children dancing, tumbling, laughing, brief flashes of joy that break through the fog of history. It is a reminder that even in hardship, childhood could still sparkle. Even church festivals were moments of youthful chaos. During the Feast of Fools or the Boy Bishop tradition, children were given roles of power, mock sermons, playful parades, a temporary inversion of order. For a brief moment, laughter replaced labor. It didn't last, but perhaps it stayed in memory longer than the chores. And though many children died young, the harsh reality of medieval disease and hunger, those who survived carried their childhood within them. In lullabies sung to their own children. In rituals passed down. In the stories they whispered by firelight. Childhood was not uniform, not soft, not always kind. But it was real. And it mattered. So as you listen now, with the soft hum of night around you, remember this: for most children in the medieval world, education came not from books, but from life itself. From hardship, from repetition, from quiet observance. It was not less worthy. It was just different. Now take a moment. Let your thoughts settle. The firelight is low. The sky outside is turning velvet. And in the fields beyond the village, a child is still awake, watching the stars, wondering what tomorrow will ask of them. The morning air in a medieval village did not carry the sharp rush of urgency that marks our own time. Instead, it drifted through the narrow lanes with the scent of wet soil, wood smoke, and animals. In this quiet rhythm, the youngest children began their day. Not yet tethered to the full demands of labor or learning, they were the softest figures within the hard edges of medieval life. Yet even at the age of 4, 5, or 6, their days were not idle. For a medieval child, even the earliest years held expectations, both spoken and unspoken, about how one ought to live, move, and obey. Many were up before the sun had climbed the thatched rooftops. In the dim interior of their family's one-room home, a child might be shaken awake by a mother's rough whisper or nudged by a sibling's foot. Beds were rare. Most children slept in piles of straw or wool-stuffed sacks, sometimes huddled together for warmth. In winter, the air inside was barely warmer than the cold beyond the walls, and small hands learned early to move quickly, to dress, to stoke the fire, to fetch water, to be useful. A child of 6 might be given the task of watching a younger sibling. Another might be sent to the stream to bring back water in a wooden bucket almost too heavy for their thin arms. Still others wandered the edge of fields, chasing off birds with rattles or shouting at pigs that wandered too close to the garden patch. These were small labors, but labors nonetheless. Childhood was not considered a time of innocence, but rather the beginning of duty. For those born to peasant families, which is to say, almost everyone, there were no toys in the modern sense. A carved stick, a ball of rags, a wooden hoop, or a collection of stones could be transformed into a world of play. Yet that play always existed within the shadow of adult work. You could laugh, but not too loud. Run, but not too far. Your father might need you. Your mother might call. And you learned quickly that ignoring their voice brought swift consequence. Language, too, came early. A medieval child might not have been taught to read or write, unless they were lucky enough to be born into nobility or into the church's care, but they learned to listen. They learned how to speak with deference. They learned the rhythm of adult voices, the sharp bark of orders, and the softer tones of stories told by firelight. These early years were their schooling, not of letters, but of behavior. Politeness, obedience, and usefulness were praised. Laziness or loudness could earn a slap or worse. Children learned about death almost as early as they learned about life. In many households, a child had already lost a sibling, sometimes more than one. It was not uncommon for infants to die in the cradle, for toddlers to slip into illness and never recover. There were no vaccinations, no understanding of germs. A cough could turn fatal. A fever might never break. This constant brush with mortality meant that many children were not even named until weeks after birth. Parents, out of fear or pragmatism, waited, unsure if their newborn would live long enough to be claimed with a name. Yet for those who did survive, childhood was not a place of isolation. It was embedded into the thick braid of family life. A 4-year-old might follow their mother to the communal oven, watching how dough was shaped and marked. A 5-year-old boy might trail behind his father, learning the shape of tools or the layout of the barley field. These were not formal lessons, but silent apprenticeships, an education not of books, but of being. In the evenings, the youngest ones often curled into laps or nestled under arms as older siblings told stories. These tales were passed down by memory, legends of saints, warnings about fairies, or the exploits of brave knights and clever peasants. There was laughter, yes. There was wonder. And there was fear. The world of a medieval child was not cleanly divided between fantasy and reality. A ghost seen in the woods, a demon whispered about near the well, or a cursed stone, these were not make-believe. They were part of the same world that held their home, their bread, and their chores. Food was simple, and a child's portion was smaller than most. Porridge in the morning, perhaps some black bread by midday, and if luck was kind, a bowl of stew in the evening. Children were not asked what they wanted to eat. They ate what there was. And they learned quickly not to complain. There was laughter. There were friendships. Children found each other, in fields, near streams, between rows of vegetables or behind barns. Games were played with hands and feet, with imagination and scraps. Hide and seek, leap over stones, guess the riddle. These moments of joy, fleeting, stolen, were stitched into the fabric of otherwise hard days. But even in play, the lessons were clear: don't stray too far. Don't dirty your tunic. And never play when work is to be done. Punishment was common and rarely gentle. A child who lied, stole, or disobeyed could be whipped, locked in a shed, or denied food. Discipline was often harsh, not out of cruelty, but out of belief. In a world where survival required obedience and endurance, softness was considered a danger. Better a child learn pain early than risk ruin later. Or so many parents believed. Still, there was love, though it may not look as we expect it today. A mother might pull a child close while stirring a pot, brushing their hair with fingers knotted from labor. A father might carve a small wooden animal as a gift, or teach his son to sharpen a blade with care. These gestures, though brief, told children, you matter. You belong. And perhaps most importantly, you are being prepared. For what? For a world that would not wait for them. For a world that did not lower itself to meet children, but expected children to rise, quickly, quietly, and with strength. By the age of 7, many were already considered little adults. Their days lengthened. Their responsibilities increased. The soft season of early childhood was drawing to a close. And yet, for just a few years, before the full weight of expectation settled on their shoulders, medieval children could still pretend. Still giggle. Still hold tight to the edges of their mother's skirt, or chase shadows beneath a gray evening sky. These years, though short, were a cradle of identity. Within the hunger and the cold and the silence, a child still dreamed. Still hoped. Still lived. It is easy to forget them, these youngest threads in the great tapestry of the Middle Ages. But their lives, their laughter, their losses, were real. And when we step back to look at that tapestry as a whole, we realize it is they who held many of the frayed edges together. So tonight, as the world around you quiets, think of the child waking at dawn to the smell of smoke and the sound of hooves. Think of the girl crouched near the hearth, brushing crumbs from the floor. Think of the boy whispering a made-up story to a little sister before sleep. They were not princes or warriors, but they were there. And they mattered. Now take a deep breath. Let your thoughts slow. The fire has faded to embers. The village is dark. And somewhere in the past, a child turns over in their straw bed, sighing softly, dreaming of a world where they might someday be more than what they were told. The air is cool and moist as the sky begins its slow transformation from indigo to a smoky blue. It is morning, just after dawn, in a quiet English village in the late 13th century. The faint light catches on the thatched roofs and stone hearths of cottages clustered along the main dirt path, and a thin mist curls around the doorframes like breath from a sleeping beast. Inside one of these humble homes, no bigger than a modern garage, a child stirs beneath a woven woolen blanket. She is 8 years old, perhaps 7, it's hard to say for certain. Her name may never make it into any records, and yet this moment in her life is as real and precious as any etched in stone or ink. She sleeps beside her siblings, 3 of them packed closely on a straw mattress. Her mother is already up, silently feeding the embers of the hearth with a few twigs. There is no clock, no alarm, only instinct, routine, and the rooster's slow call echoing across the fields. The girl stretches. Her bones ache faintly from the cold. There is no glass in the window to keep the chill out, only oiled cloth. But there's comfort in the weight of her siblings, and the smoky scent of the hearth beginning to warm the air. Her feet are bare. Her hands chapped. But she is loved, and she is needed. By the age of 7 or 8, medieval children were no longer merely children in the way we understand it today. They had already begun their slow integration into the adult world, expected to learn, to work, to carry, to serve. Childhood, in the modern sense, was short. Not always harsh, but certainly brief. The girl rises and pulls a coarse linen tunic over her night shift. It is scratchy. It itches. But it is hers. Her mother places a small bowl of pottage, a kind of thick, savory porridge made from leftover grain, peas, or onions, into her hands. There's little talking. The house is too cold for chatter, and everyone knows their place. Outside, her father is already tending the firewood or mending a fence. The boy next door is sweeping out the animal stall. The miller's daughter, aged 9, is already walking the narrow path to the stream to fetch water. Each child, in every cottage, is absorbed into the rhythm of survival. Tasks are age-appropriate but never optional. She takes her place beside her older brother and begins grinding rye grain in a quernstone, a heavy hand mill. Round and round, the stone groans with each turn. The powdery scent of grain clings to her sleeves. It is monotonous, physical work, and it must be done every morning. If she lives in a manor village, one tied to a noble's estate, her day might also include gleaning in the fields during harvest months, or gathering firewood, or helping drive geese to market. If she's lucky, she may be taught to spin thread, or help card wool, or stir the laundry pot. Each task builds muscle and memory. Each movement draws her further away from the innocence of infancy, and closer to the expectations of womanhood. There are no toys in the modern sense, but games still exist. When the grain is done and the chores complete, she and the neighboring children may roll hoops or toss knucklebones, small animal bones used like dice. In the winter, they may skate across frozen streams using polished animal bones tied to their feet. Laughter does exist here, sharp, fleeting, and always welcome. The adult world looms large, but childhood does carve out small moments of joy. Some children, boys especially, may be sent to a nearby abbey or church school, where they learn basic Latin or Psalms if their family can afford to let them go. But for most, particularly girls, education means repetition and imitation, learning to bake, to fetch, to mend, to hush babies to obey. Her name, again, we do not know. But her life is not lost to time. Through bones unearthed in graveyards, through documents of peasant obligations, through sermons that warned of idleness and disobedience, we can piece together fragments of her world. And in doing so, we feel the pulse of a morning that looked much like any other, a day filled with labor, interrupted by short bursts of play, and woven through with duty, discipline, and the occasional stolen moment of delight. Because medieval childhood was not an era of carefree exploration. It was a slow rehearsal for the burdens of adulthood. And for this child, this small girl with grain under her fingernails and soot on her sleeves, the village has already awakened her to the quiet reality of who she is expected to become. By midday, her legs ache. Her back bends over another task. She doesn't think of fairness. She doesn't wonder what might have been. She simply does. And in that act, in her small, everyday resilience, we find the real rhythm of life for children in the medieval world. The wind has shifted. There is a dampness in the air, thick with the scent of wet straw and tallow smoke. And in the dim corner of a modest cottage, a child lies curled upon a straw bed, her face flushed and her limbs twitching in sleep. She is no older than 6, and tonight she is ill. In the medieval world, childhood was marked not just by growth and labor, but by the constant presence of fragility. Sickness could come swiftly, a simple cough, a scratch from a tool, a chill caught while drawing water, and before long, a fever could claim what a year of careful raising had built. There is no hospital here, no thermometer, no antibiotics or knowledge of germs. Only the wisdom of mothers and midwives, the rhythm of prayers, and the crude guidance of humors and potions. For this little one, her fate rests in warmth, faith, and time. Her mother sits beside her, dipping a cloth in warm water steeped with herbs, perhaps chamomile, if it's spring, or yarrow. She presses it to the girl's forehead, whispering quiet blessings. The father, helpless in his worry, crouches near the hearth, feeding it steadily, trying to keep the room warm and alive. In a nearby basket, a wax candle burns beside an old saint's token, maybe Saint Margaret, protector of children, or Saint Blaise, guardian of throats. The line between prayer and medicine was thin. When knowledge failed, people turned to symbols, relics, hope. The girl stirs, her breath rasping faintly. She is burning with fever, her small chest rising and falling in irregular waves. At times, she speaks in murmurs, jumbled words, bits of rhyme, a memory of a song she once sang while picking gooseberries. Her mother weeps quietly, not from panic but from the deep ache of helplessness. She has seen too many children lost in this village. Too many funerals borne on shoulders far too used to the weight of tiny bodies. Child mortality in the medieval period was staggeringly high. Nearly 1 in every 3 or 4 children would not reach their 5th birthday. A fever could mean the pox. A chill might become pneumonia. An infected wound could turn septic within a day. Even teething was a danger if it led to fever or swelling. Yet care was not absent. Love was not scarce. The notion that medieval families were cold or indifferent to their young is far from the truth. These parents loved fiercely, perhaps more urgently, because they knew how brief that love might be. Every embrace could be the last. Every night's sleep might be a farewell unspoken. When remedies were attempted, they came in many forms. Herbal poultices wrapped in cloth. Chicken broth boiled with leeks. Smoked herbs waved over the child's head. In noble households, a physician might be summoned, bearing exotic spices like saffron or powdered pearls, thought to rebalance the humors. But in peasant cottages, it was elderflower, garlic, honey, or holy water, whatever could be gathered, blessed, and trusted. Sometimes, the illness passed. The fever broke in the quietest hours, and the child awoke with sunken eyes and a trembling voice, but alive. The family would thank God. A candle might be lit at the village chapel. Bread would be offered to the poor in gratitude. Other times, the room would go quiet. The breath would slow, then stop. And the mother would know before anyone else, because the weight of silence on a child's lips is louder than any scream. The community would gather. Neighbors would bring linen and herbs to prepare the small body for burial. A short procession would wind toward the churchyard, where the child would be laid to rest in a grave not yet fully marked. Sometimes a wooden cross would be placed. Sometimes only memory would remain. But the mourning was not hidden. It was not rushed. In many parts of Europe, especially in the countryside, families would observe long periods of mourning. Mothers wore dark wool. Fathers might leave offerings at the local shrine. And siblings, if they were old enough to understand, were told the truth, not with euphemism, but with solemn reverence. The child had returned to God, they were told. To heaven. To peace. Not every illness ended in death, of course. Many children survived, and those who did often emerged quieter, more inward, marked in ways that lingered. A girl who once danced freely might now walk slower, watchful of every breeze. A boy once wild might become contemplative, staring longer at the fire than playing by the stream. Health in childhood was a fragile, flickering candle, one that every family in the medieval world knew could gutter at any moment. But even in this fragility, life continued. It had to. And perhaps that's what made every survival so sacred. Every morning breath. Every returned smile. Every hand grasped in the darkness. Because when a medieval child fell ill, the village watched with bated breath. And when that child awoke again, voice hoarse, belly hungry, eyes brighter than the day before, there was, for a moment, a small, unspoken miracle. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, hope has always found a way to survive. In the quiet hours just before sunrise, a small town might stir with footsteps not of merchants or travelers, but of a child, a boy of 12 or a girl barely older, stepping out of their home with a sack slung over one shoulder and a future carved by someone else's hands. This was the morning of departure, the first real farewell. For many medieval children, apprenticeship was not just a stage of life, it was a sudden transformation, a departure from the comforts of home and the protections of childhood, straight into the unknown world of adult work and rigid expectation. The apprenticeship system was one of the great turning points in a young life. In England, France, and much of Europe, a child might be bound to a master, often at the age of 10 to 14, and live under his roof for 7 or more years. The term bound wasn't just a metaphor. Contracts were signed. Oaths were taken. Sometimes the child's own parent would hand over a symbolic coin, or place their child's hand into the hand of the master as a solemn gesture, a living transaction, the transfer of obedience. To the child, it might have felt like stepping into another world. A weaver's shop, with looms creaking and threads hanging like tangled webs. Or a blacksmith's forge, where the air was thick with iron smoke and the clang of hammers. In larger towns, there were bakers, coopers, cobblers, chandlers. Every trade had its tools, its tempo, its secrets. And for the apprentice, the first lesson was always the same: obedience and silence. Imagine a boy, just 13, bent over a leather strap, learning to cut it with precision. His fingers blister, but he doesn't cry out. Across the room, the master watches with a calm coldness. No praise is given. That is not the medieval way. In this world, progress is expected, not celebrated. A mistake is corrected not with words, but often with a slap or a harsh scolding. These apprentices were not guests. They were labor being shaped. But not all apprenticeships were cruel. Some masters treated their wards with stern kindness. They were fed, clothed, and sometimes even educated, especially if the guild they entered was proud and established. In the larger cities, certain guilds enforced codes of conduct. A master could be fined for neglecting an apprentice or for beating them excessively. The church, too, sometimes spoke up for the protection of young souls in the working world. But these were exceptions. And the line between guidance and punishment was often blurred by the pressures of poverty, ambition, and old habits. For girls, apprenticeship took a different shape. While some girls trained as seamstresses, brewers, or even merchants in the rare towns that allowed it, most were folded into households. Their apprenticeship was domestic. They learned to manage a kitchen, tend to infants, spin flax, or maintain the fine rhythms of noble service. To enter a wealthy household as a servant or companion was considered a respectable path for a young girl of modest birth. But it was also a vulnerable position, one that could bring favor or fear. A master's house could be a place of quiet instruction or a cage of unspoken threats. And always, there was distance. Distance from home, from parents, from the warmth of familiarity. Letters were rare. Visits even rarer. An apprentice lived where they worked, often sleeping above the shop or beside the storeroom. Their bed might be a straw pallet. Their meals simple bread and broth. Their thoughts, unknown. For though we know the contracts they signed and the tools they touched, we cannot hear the thoughts of a child on their 3rd year away from home, wondering if their mother still missed them or if their father had grown ill. Yet from these apprenticeships emerged the craftspeople who built the medieval world. The carpenters who carved cathedrals. The tailors who dressed noble courts. The scribes who copied sacred texts. The goldsmiths who engraved wedding rings and reliquaries. All had once been children, standing awkwardly beside a bench, unsure of their worth. The process was slow and often lonely, but it worked. Mastery was not a gift, but a grind. And there was status in success. A skilled apprentice could one day become a journeyman, then a master. To join a guild, truly join it, was a mark of arrival. It meant your work bore quality, your name carried weight, and your life could stretch beyond mere survival. Some even rose further, becoming aldermen, town leaders, or wealthy patrons themselves. For boys from peasant families, this was one of the few ladders available. But the climb was steep, and not all made it. Apprentices could be dismissed, or worse, abandoned. A bad master might send a child packing with no compensation. A failed apprentice could return home in disgrace. Some wandered between towns, hoping to find another shop, another chance. In the records of London and Rouen and Cologne, there are glimpses of boys gone astray, girls missing from service, contracts broken, names forgotten. Not every child who entered the system emerged from it whole. And so the memory of apprenticeship is a complex one, a story of structure, of opportunity, but also of loss. It marked the end of play, the end of protection. It was not school, though some learned to read. It was not family, though some found kindness. It was something harder to define, a molding of the self through labor, repetition, and waiting. Some children, decades later, remembered those years with fondness. Others never spoke of them again. The medieval world was full of beginnings, of rites of passage, and this was one of the quietest, yet most permanent. Childhood, as we imagine it today, was brief. An apprenticeship was the doorway out of it. Even today, if you walk through the narrow streets of a preserved medieval town, York, Bruges, Rothenburg, you might find old workshops with wooden signs and wide windows. Inside, the echoes of those apprentices remain. In the creak of a floorboard, in the worn edge of a worktable, in the quiet discipline of a craft that once shaped not only goods, but children. They learned with their hands. They endured in silence. And somewhere between the stitching of a hem or the striking of a chisel, a child disappeared, and an adult began. It is early afternoon in a modest village at the edge of a forest, the sunlight filtering softly through high tree branches as children gather in a dusty courtyard. The air is filled with the squeak of wooden wheels, the click of stones, and the occasional burst of giggles as children chase one another around an old oak stump. In moments like this, medieval childhood seems strangely familiar, full of imagination, games, and laughter echoing between stone walls. But behind the joy of play lies another truth. The medieval world, though deeply affectionate toward its young, was also unforgiving, shaped by sharp lines of discipline, obedience, and the burden of early responsibility. Games, in the medieval world, were often handmade and passed down like treasured songs. Children played with carved wooden dolls, hoop and stick, blind man's bluff, and knucklebones made from sheep's joints, each game echoing ancient rhythms of shared delight. Boys might fashion a ball from animal bladder and leather, kicking it through village streets in chaotic team sports that resembled modern football only in spirit. Girls, mimicking their mothers, often played domestic games, pretending to bake with pebbles and leaves, or cradling a small doll in their arms as if it were a younger sibling. There were no toy stores. There were no birthday parties. But play still had its place, scattered in stolen hours after chores and before nightfall. In wealthier households, noble children might have access to more elaborate amusements. Pet monkeys, trained birds, intricately carved chess sets, and even miniature gardens could be found in noble nurseries. The courtly child was often surrounded by jesters, tutors, and musicians, and yet the strict decorum of courtly life still clung to their shoulders. Play was sometimes an act of performance, dancing before nobles, reciting lines from Latin plays, or practicing graceful movements for future banquets. Even fun was training for adulthood. But in the countryside, where most children lived, games were woven into survival. Children chased geese not for sport but to corral them. They climbed trees not for daring but to shake down fruit for supper. Fun happened on the margins of work, tucked between milking the goats and collecting kindling. Still, within these small windows, children built wild, temporary kingdoms. A patch of reeds became a fortress. A broken bucket became a knight's helmet. These fleeting worlds lived only in their imaginations, and vanished at the sound of their mother's voice calling them home. Yet as quickly as laughter could rise, it could also disappear. The same voices that laughed in the morning might fall silent by dusk, silenced by scolding or punishment. Discipline in the medieval world was not simply accepted, it was expected. The rod, the switch, the harsh word, all were considered part of loving upbringing. A proverb echoed through many households. Spare the rod and spoil the child. To modern ears it may sound cruel, but in their world, obedience meant survival. A child who disobeyed could fall into danger, in the hearth, in the barn, on the road. Correction was thought to be protection. Punishment was not limited to physical discipline. There were cold meals for those who lied, extra chores for those who stole apples, public shame for those who talked back to elders. In rare cases, especially among the poor, Children could be sent to another household as a form of correction, placed into servitude under a stern master to teach them discipline. This was not framed as abuse, but as necessity. Harsh, yes. But in a world where one accident could cost a life, the margin for error was terribly thin. Religious households, particularly monasteries, approached childhood with a different blend of discipline and grace. Novice boys and girls, training in the abbey, were often subjected to strict routines, waking at dawn, chanting psalms, eating in silence. Here, discipline was spiritual, a form of shaping the soul as much as the body. A novice who disobeyed might be made to kneel for hours, or copy out scripture until their fingers cramped. Yet many found comfort in the rhythm, the order, the predictability. In a chaotic world, the abbey was still and eternal. Despite the severity of discipline, love and affection were not absent from medieval homes. Parents did not discipline out of malice. Many mothers wept as they punished their children. Fathers sat quietly by the fire afterward, wondering if they'd gone too far. But they were bound by the same world that shaped their own childhoods, one where hardship was a teacher, and obedience the path to safety. Many children, once grown, would remember a mother's hand not as harsh, but as steady. A father's voice not as frightening, but firm. Between play and punishment, the rhythm of childhood beat steadily forward. Seasons passed. The games changed. The rules grew stricter. And by the time a child was 12 or 13, play had nearly vanished. Their hands had grown calloused, their backs stronger. Their eyes, once wide with wonder, began to narrow with responsibility. For girls, womanhood came early. For boys, apprenticeship or fieldwork awaited. Childhood, in the medieval world, ended not with a celebration, but with silence. A quiet slipping away into the world of adults. Still, echoes of their younger selves remained. Some elders would tell stories of games they once played by moonlight. Others would smile quietly at the sound of children laughing in the fields. A few, perhaps, kept small trinkets, a carved doll, a smooth stone, a knucklebone, hidden in chests beside old linens and keepsakes. Proof that even in the harshest of times, children had not only survived, but lived. And so, the balance endured, joy and sorrow, freedom and restraint, lightness and gravity. Medieval children walked a line between laughter and silence, between play and punishment. And though their world was harder than ours, their hearts, perhaps, were not so different. Even now, if you close your eyes and listen closely, you might hear it, the sound of a wooden hoop rolling along a stone path, followed by the delighted shriek of a barefoot child chasing after it. A moment of pure, fleeting joy. Lost in time, but never quite forgotten. The heavy curtains are drawn, but the warmth of the early afternoon sun still slips in through the edges. You're inside a chamber that smells faintly of lavender water, old wood, and warmed milk. This is no grand hall nor ceremonial room. This is the nursery of the royal palace, a place that should be filled with gentle laughter, soft lullabies, and the rustling of linen and wool as children are swaddled, rocked, and told ancient stories passed down through generations. But something here is off. The nursemaids speak in whispers. Their hands move precisely, dutifully, but without joy. The rocking cradle in the corner has not moved in some time. And the child inside it, swaddled in fine cloth, embroidered with golden thread, is still. Not asleep. Just still. They call him a prince. The heir. The miracle child. The one who represents not only the future of a dynasty but the purity of centuries of royal blood. But to those who tend to him, it is not purity they see. It is fragility. Something too soft for this world. Something so deeply wrong, and yet so deeply protected. There is a physician in the room now. His beard is thin, gray, and trembles as he bends toward the infant. He has done this many times before. He unwraps the layers carefully, noting how the limbs bend oddly, how the eyes flutter but never quite settle. He doesn't speak. He simply rewraps the child, writes a note in a shaking hand, and steps quietly away. In another corner, a young nursemaid sits with her back to the others. She is sewing, her needle rising and falling through a small garment. Her eyes, however, are not on the thread. They are glassy, distant. She has seen something she cannot forget. She was there on the day the child was born. She remembers the silence. The way the midwives' faces froze when they saw what had arrived. They had all expected a moment of triumph. The birth of a royal heir is a sacred event, after all, one that secures the line, calms the kingdom, and binds families together with celebration. But that day, there had been no music, no bells, no cheers from the palace steps. Only the quiet rush of feet, the cold whisper of orders, and a silence that stretched into the days that followed. The mother, the queen, had not seen her child for hours after the birth. She had screamed, not from pain, but from confusion. "Where is he? Where is my son?" she had demanded, her voice hoarse with both worry and love. And when they finally brought the infant to her, something in her gaze cracked. She cradled him, yes, but she did not sing. There are whispers now that the child has a condition. A vague word, used carefully in court. No one is permitted to be specific. The royal physicians have drafted new titles for the boy. Delicate. Unusually formed. Spiritually burdened. But beneath it all, the truth hovers like smoke. The boy is the product of bloodlines woven too tightly together. Centuries of unbroken royal marriage, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, have created not a lineage of divine strength, but of soft bone, twisted limbs, and minds that struggle in the dark. And so the nursery becomes a strange sort of shrine. Not one of joy, but of quiet damage. The tapestries here are no longer bright depictions of myth and legend. They are faded, softened by years of sun, depicting angelic children with distant, almost lifeless expressions. Like the boy in the cradle. One maid is tasked only with singing to him. Every morning and every night. Her voice is clear, gentle, unwavering. She sings the same tune again and again, not for comfort perhaps, but to remind the walls that this is still a prince. A royal child. Even if the court avoids his name. Even if he will never sit on a throne. But outside these nursery doors, a very different world spins on. The court pretends. The advisors plot. The portraits in the hall are repainted to exaggerate strength and vitality. The king insists that his line is blessed. The queen smiles through her silence. No one speaks of what truly grows behind that door, what nurses hide in layers of velvet and lace. And the boy? He grows. Slowly, uncertainly, but he grows. Some days his eyes are open, his hands twitching as if remembering something he cannot name. Other days he does not move at all. The maids pray softly on those days. They light candles behind curtains. They do not call the doctor unless absolutely necessary. Because each time he comes, there is the risk of truth. There's another secret in this room. One that doesn't appear in the physician's notes, or the queen's private letters. It is known only to those who rock the cradle late at night, when the palace is quiet and the wind rattles the shutters. The child sometimes hums. Not a song. Not even a sound with shape. But a low, broken hum, like a voice trying to find its way back to something. A memory? A dream? A cry? No one knows. And the nurses do not speak of it in the light of day. They pretend it never happens. But in the dark, they sometimes press their palms together and whisper, "May God watch over him." This chapter of the royal tale is not written in treaties or carved in stone. It lives in the quiet moments. The folding of small clothes. The cooling of untouched food. The sound of lullabies sung to someone who may never understand them. It is a story whispered between servants, buried in palace walls, passed down not through official records, but through sorrow and silence. And yet, there is still tenderness here. Deep, aching tenderness. In every rocked cradle. In every mended shirt. In every soft word spoken to a child who may never speak back. Because even among the grand horrors of bloodlines and power, humanity survives. Even if only in a nursery no one wants to speak about. It is morning in a quiet medieval town. Not bustling, not yet. The cobbles are still damp from the dew, and the shop's signs barely sway with the lightest breeze. But inside many of the homes behind those crooked wooden shutters, something is already beginning. The sound of a latch lifting. The creak of a wooden door. A boy of 10 or 12 stepping into the street with his tools in a cloth sack, carefully slung over one shoulder. His eyes are still heavy with sleep, but he walks steadily. He is an apprentice now, no longer a child, not quite a man, and the town will shape him before the sun sets. Apprenticeship in the Middle Ages was the beginning of something, and the end of something else. This chapter in the life of a medieval child often began far earlier than one might expect. As young as 7 or 8, a child might already be promised to a trade. It was the natural outcome of family decisions not driven by passion or curiosity, but by survival. If you were lucky, your family could arrange an apprenticeship with a trusted craftsperson. Blacksmiths, coopers, tanners, weavers, millers, every village had its crafts, and every master needed hands that could learn quickly and obey quietly. The exchange was often sealed with a handshake, a simple meal, or in some cases, a formal written contract if the family had means. The boy, and sometimes, though rarely, a girl, would leave home. Sometimes for a year. Sometimes for 7. Sometimes they never returned. Apprenticeship was not school. It was a blend of service, labor, and very slow training. The child apprentice swept floors, fetched wood, fed animals, carried water, and only gradually, over many months or years, was allowed to touch the tools of the trade. Mistakes were punished, sometimes sharply. Instruction was repetitive and slow. There were no books to explain, no classrooms to practice in, only imitation, repetition, correction. To learn a trade was to observe in silence, try in fear, and one day, be trusted. For children in towns and cities, this system created both a clear path and a weighty burden. A butcher's apprentice could one day own a shop, feed his family, and take on apprentices of his own. But until that day came, the child's life was one of obedience, exhaustion, and constant pressure not to fail. It was a silent kind of pressure, unspoken, but always there, in the look of the master, in the calloused hands of the journeyman, in the quiet glances of townspeople who would one day become your customers, or your judges. And yet, for all its harshness, apprenticeship also gave medieval children something valuable: structure, identity, even a sense of pride. Unlike the youngest peasants whose futures were tied to the land without question, an apprentice could imagine a different path. He wore a leather apron, learned to sharpen blades, mix dyes, heated metal, carved wood. These were not games. These were not chores. These were pieces of a life being built, one repetition at a time. The bonds that formed between apprentices and their masters could be as cold as stone or as warm as family. Some masters were strict but fair, taking pride in shaping a child into a skilled craftsman. Others were cruel, treating apprentices more like servants than students. In many guilds, the master had full legal control over the apprentice. Discipline could include public scolding, withholding food, or even corporal punishment. The child's parents, often far away, had no say. Girls entered apprenticeships far less often, but when they did, it was usually in spinning, embroidery, brewing, or domestic service. Some trained with their mothers or within women's guilds, but most often they were simply sent into households, as servants, nursemaids, or kitchen assistants, where they might learn the rhythms of domestic management. Their labor was undervalued, their skill development undocumented. But the expectations placed upon them were no less demanding. In wealthier families, apprenticeship took on a more formalized shape. A boy from a merchant background might be sent to a larger town to learn from a prominent master, not just the trade itself, but also the manners, customs, and language of business. These apprentices might wear better clothes, live in cleaner quarters, and receive letters from home. But the expectations were just as high, and failure still brought shame. In the towns and cities of late medieval England, France, or the Low Countries, merchant families invested heavily in their sons' apprenticeships, not just for the skill, but for the connections. Life during apprenticeship was often lonely. These children were removed from the world of games and songs and family tables. Their time was not their own. They rose with the sun, worked in dim light, and fell asleep wherever they were allowed, sometimes in lofts, sometimes in barns, sometimes on straw beside the forge. Weekends were not rest days, and even feast days brought only brief interruptions. Some apprentices were treated with kindness and fed well. Others were little more than live-in laborers. Still, small joys appeared like sparks. The first time the master praised a smooth cut of wood, the day a tool was finally entrusted without supervision, or a rare evening when older apprentices gathered in secret to trade jokes or share bits of news. The human spirit finds ways to glow, even under pressure. Guilds added another layer to this world. In many towns, each trade had its own guild, an association of masters that regulated prices, training, competition, and quality. For apprentices, the guild offered both opportunity and gatekeeping. To become a journeyman, one had to serve the full term of apprenticeship, often 7 years, and be approved by the guild. That approval could be a formality, or a steep wall. It depended on your connections, your behavior, and whether the town had room for one more competitor. For peasant children who never became apprentices, early labor looked different but was no less demanding. By the age of 7, a child might be tasked with herding sheep, collecting dung, carrying firewood, or guarding fields. These were jobs with real consequences. A single stray animal could cost the village dearly. A fire left untended could spread to barns. Even these simplest jobs required a kind of vigilance and endurance far beyond a child's years. Mistakes were met with adult consequences. What's remarkable is how little room there was for childhood as we think of it today. Play existed, yes, children played with bones, sticks, carved dolls, and hoops. But play was squeezed between tasks. It was not a right. It was a luxury. The moment a child could carry something, they did. The moment they could understand, they were expected to obey. And the moment they could perform, they were placed into the machinery of survival. The idea of working age was fluid. Children were not transitioned into labor. They were raised within it. A child was not asked if he was ready. He was expected to rise, to observe, to imitate, and to endure. The body adjusted to the weight of the sack, the roughness of the rope, the heat of the forge. These children didn't become strong, they had no choice but to be strong. And yet, in all of this, in the dust and the sweat, in the endless repetition, there were sparks of future identity. A young boy who learned to carve well might begin to shape not just wood but his own imagination. A girl who mastered the rhythms of the hearth might begin to see herself not just as a servant, but as a maker of stability. In these quiet, grinding days, the earliest foundations of self-worth and skill were laid. Apprenticeship, like so much of medieval life, was not about dreams. It was about endurance. But within that endurance, many children found shape, direction, and a form of purpose. And long after they had finished their years of service, many looked back on those years not with bitterness, but with something strangely close to pride. Perhaps not because it was kind, but because they survived it. The year is 1680, and the royal corridors of the Alcazar in Madrid carry a strange kind of silence. Not the soft hush of reverence or peace, but the brittle, uncomfortable quiet that lingers in places where no one speaks plainly. By now, Charles II is 19 years old, a young king in name, but not in power. His reign is still watched over by regents, courtiers, priests, and physicians, each maneuvering for influence in a palace where uncertainty rules more surely than the crown itself. He walks slowly down a corridor in the early morning, his stiff gait echoing softly on the stone floor. Behind him trails a physician, whose presence is more guardian than servant. At this point in Charles's life, he is never alone. Not truly. There is always someone watching, always someone taking notes on his health, his movements, his speech. The king's body has become a matter of state concern, and a source of fear. Because in this fragile young monarch rests the hopes of the most powerful dynasty in Europe. And that body, so pale and soft, so racked with illness, is showing no signs of producing an heir. Charles's court, in this chapter of his story, becomes something like a quiet war zone. But the weapons are not swords or cannons. They are rumors, documents, prayers, and poisons. Behind fans and curtains, in whispers and sideways glances, people question how long the king will last, and who will inherit the fragments of an empire if he dies childless. Ambassadors write home in secret codes. Priests write to Rome in alarm. And the queen, poor Maria Louisa of Orleans, walks the tightrope of being both wife and failed mother. Maria Louisa was just 17 when she arrived from France to marry Charles. Bright, graceful, and intelligent, she had been raised to be charming. But no charm could prepare her for what she found in Madrid. Her husband was kind, perhaps, in a pitiful way. But he was also nearly nonverbal at times, overly dependent on his mother, and subject to long periods of illness and confusion. The queen, barely past girlhood herself, soon found that her greatest duty, producing an heir, was also her greatest heartbreak. By 1685, their marriage remained unconsummated in any meaningful way. Courtiers and clerics began to murmur. Some blamed her. Others blamed him. And still others blamed God. Physicians conducted humiliating examinations of both husband and wife, while alchemists and healers offered potions that promised to rouse fertility. But nothing worked. The queen's tears became so frequent that chroniclers noted her constant sorrow in official records. In private letters she was called La Reina Triste, the sad queen. And so Charles's court turned inward. As the decades-long experiment of royal inbreeding bore its strangest fruit in the person of this lonely king, the palace became obsessed with omens. Superstition flourished where medicine failed. Exorcisms were conducted in secret chambers. Amulets were hidden beneath pillows. A rumor spread that the king had been cursed at birth, not by witches, but by the sins of his ancestors, compounded over generations and sealed in blood. From the outside, Spain still maintained its grandeur. But inside the Alcazar, behind thick velvet drapes and under golden ceilings, the court was unraveling. Charles would frequently lose his sense of time. He struggled to chew food and often choked at state dinners. His jaw, malformed and heavy, made it difficult to speak clearly. He could barely walk upstairs unaided. And yet, somehow, he continued, a flickering candle no one dared extinguish, because to do so would mean confronting the empire's collapse. The weight on Charles was spiritual, too. The Spanish court was one of the most devoutly Catholic in Europe, and Charles was raised to see his kingship as divinely ordained. But as he aged and failed to produce an heir, that divine narrative began to crack. Was it possible, some whispered, that God had rejected this king? That the Habsburg line had offended heaven through its arrogance, its blood purity laws, and its relentless pursuit of dominance? These were not questions spoken aloud. But they were asked, in prayer, in poetry, in nightmares. One courtier, in a diary that survived only in fragments, described visiting Charles in his study late at night. The king was bent over a page, drawing small circles again and again, his lips moving in silent prayer. He looked up and said softly, "My line ends with me." And then, just as softly, "It must." No one corrected him. Because by then, the truth was too obvious to deny. Maria Louisa, meanwhile, fell into a deep melancholy. She rarely left her chambers and developed sudden weight loss and fainting spells. Some modern historians believe she may have suffered from a nervous breakdown, or perhaps even been poisoned, not out of malice, but out of a desperate attempt to replace her with someone more productive. In 1689, she died at just 26 years old. The official cause was listed as appendicitis. But few believed it. Charles, inconsolable, ordered a national mourning period. He wore black for months. But even in grief, there was expectation. Another marriage must be arranged. Another queen must be chosen. Another attempt must be made. And so, the court moved on, as courts always do. The whispers did not stop. By this point, Spain's court had become a paradox. Immense wealth and gold still flowed in from the Americas, but the monarchy itself seemed brittle, hollowed out. A gilded shell surrounding a fragile man. Ministers came and went. Councils shifted alliances. And through it all, Charles remained, increasingly frail, increasingly mournful, and increasingly isolated. It is a strange thing, isn't it? To imagine that the most powerful empire on earth once hung by a thread from the life of a man who could barely walk without help. But that was the truth of it. The Habsburg court had pushed the limits of dynastic purity so far that they had broken the very body meant to uphold the throne. And perhaps they knew it. Perhaps that's why, in the years that followed, those halls remained so full of silence. Not reverent silence. Not peaceful silence. But the heavy, echoing kind. The silence of waiting. The silence of dread. Because everyone knew what came next. And no one knew how to stop it. So they whispered. And they watched. And they waited. The years after Maria Luisa's death brought no relief to Charles II or to the Spanish court. Instead, they settled into a slow, agonizing rhythm, like a candle burning low in a drafty chamber, flickering with every breath, threatening to go out at any moment. The king's body grew weaker, his mind more clouded. The court's whispers turned to murmurs of despair and inevitability. Charles remarried in 1690. His new bride, Mariana of Neuburg, was a distant cousin from the German Palatinate. She was young, vibrant, and determined, a stark contrast to the fragile king she was meant to serve and support. But even she could not work miracles. The marriage remained childless. The great hope of the Habsburg lineage faded like a ghost. Behind closed doors, Mariana struggled to balance her roles. She was expected to comfort a husband too sick to provide love or companionship. To navigate a court riddled with factions, some loyal, many not. To embody the future of Spain, even as the present crumbled around her. And in the shadows, she bore the heavy burden of knowing she might be the last queen of an empire slipping toward ruin. Charles's health was a constant spectacle. His body was misshapen and swollen. His jaw so malformed that eating was a painful ordeal, often leading to choking fits. His speech became slow and slurred. He suffered from seizures and paralysis, and yet he lived. For almost 4 decades, against all odds, the king endured. This endurance was both a blessing and a curse. It prolonged the agony of a court trapped in uncertainty. Spain's enemies watched with growing impatience. France and England sensed weakness. The vast Habsburg territories, once united by a powerful monarch, now quivered under the weight of doubt. Inside the palace, intrigue intensified. Advisors jockeyed for position, pushing their own candidates and alliances. The regents who ruled in Charles's name often acted more like puppeteers, pulling strings with little concern for the man whose name they bore. Each faction whispered of succession, of alliances, of marriage treaties, all while the king lay confined by his own failing body. One of the most painful tragedies of this time was Charles's isolation. Despite the constant presence of attendants and physicians, the king was alone in a deeper sense. His illness alienated him from the vibrant life of the court. His limited ability to communicate left him misunderstood and forgotten. The bright boy who had once been heir was now a shadow, fading with every breath. The palace echoed with stories of Charles's brief moments of lucidity. When, for a fleeting time, he would recall names, or smile faintly at a memory. But those moments were brief. The shadow of his illness soon returned, pulling him back into silence and confusion. It was a slow death that spanned years. Historians who study Charles II today often struggle to separate fact from rumor. Was he mentally impaired? Was his body twisted by the inbreeding of generations? Was he the victim of poisonings or curses? The records tell a mixture of all these stories, some tragic, some darkly comic, all human. But for those who lived through his reign, there was no doubt Charles was a symbol of a dynasty in decline. His condition was the visible proof that the Habsburg obsession with blood purity had become a curse rather than a blessing. In the final years, as Charles's strength waned, the question of succession became urgent and dangerous. Spain's vast empire depended on an heir to prevent civil war and foreign invasion. But with no children and no clear successor, the throne became a prize for competing powers. The European stage was set for a conflict that would reshape the continent. Meanwhile, the people of Spain continued their lives, largely unaware of the full extent of the crisis unfolding behind palace walls. The grand ceremonies and public appearances masked the fragility beneath. To them, Charles was their king, their symbol of stability, but one whose reign was slipping through their fingers. In a quiet chamber, far from the eyes of the court, Charles would sometimes weep. Not for himself, but for the future he knew he could not secure. The weight of his crown was heavier than any man should bear, and the loneliness of his final years was profound. His story is a reminder that behind every throne lies a human being, vulnerable, imperfect, and often broken by the very power they were meant to wield. Charles II's reign was a chapter of tragedy, but also of endurance, a fragile thread holding together an empire on the edge. And as the last candle flickered low, the world waited. Not just for a king's death, but for the uncertain dawn that would follow. The dawn of November 1st, 1700, came quietly to the palace of Buon Retiro, the place where Charles II had spent his final days, surrounded by a small circle of courtiers, priests, and physicians. The king's breath, once strong and steady in his youth, had grown faint and irregular. His body, ravaged by decades of illness and malformation, lay still at last. The last of the Habsburg line was gone. For many, the news was a profound shock, despite the long anticipation. Charles II's death was not merely the passing of a monarch. It was the collapse of a dynasty that had ruled much of Europe for centuries. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of a political earthquake that would shake the continent. The king's funeral was a somber affair. In keeping with tradition, the ceremonies were elaborate, filled with prayers, chants, and displays of royal power meant to project strength even in death. Yet, beneath the grandeur, there was an undeniable sense of mourning for what had been lost. The man who had carried the Habsburg name into the 17th century was now reduced to a memory, a symbol of a lineage that had reached its bitter end. Charles's body was prepared for the traditional burial in the royal crypt of the Escorial, a monastery that had long been the resting place of his ancestors. The procession was marked by the presence of foreign diplomats, noble families, and clergy, all bearing witness to the final chapter of a troubled reign. But the death of the king brought immediate uncertainty. Without a direct heir, the question of succession ignited fierce debate and hidden plotting. The Spanish Empire, vast and powerful, was now vulnerable. Rival European powers looked hungrily at the prize, eager to influence, or claim the throne for themselves. Two main candidates emerged: the French Bourbon claimant, Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, and the Austrian Habsburg Archduke Charles. Both had strong claims through distant family ties, but each represented a different vision for Europe's future. The choice Spain made would determine the balance of power for decades. Behind the scenes, negotiations, treaties, and alliances were rapidly forming. The Treaty of Partition sought to divide the Spanish territories to avoid a large-scale war, but it was met with fierce resistance. The question was not just who would wear the crown, but how the empire itself would be divided, or preserved. For the people of Spain, these political machinations were distant and abstract. Their lives were touched by the consequences, but they understood little of the intrigues at court. They watched as the new king arrived, as flags were raised and ceremonies performed, but beneath it all lay a deep uncertainty. Philip V, as the new king was known, arrived from France with great fanfare. His accession marked the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain, but also the beginning of the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict involving much of Europe. This war would ravage the continent, bleed the treasury, and strain the loyalties of millions. Charles II's death was also a personal tragedy for those who had cared for him, or who had lived through his reign. Mariana of Neuburg, his widow, withdrew from public life, burdened by grief and the heavy memories of a reign marked by pain and isolation. The courtiers who had served Charles faced uncertain futures as alliances shifted and new rulers took power. Yet, beyond the politics and the wars, Charles II's story left a deeper legacy, a cautionary tale of the dangers of obsession with bloodlines and purity. His physical and mental ailments, the result of generations of inbreeding, were a grim reminder of the human cost behind dynastic ambition. In history, Charles is often remembered as the Bewitched king, a figure of tragedy and mystery. Some viewed him with pity, others with disdain. But all agree that his life was shaped by forces far beyond his control, forces that shaped not only his fate, but the fate of an empire. The empire itself would never be the same. The golden age of Spain had passed, replaced by a new era defined by struggle and change. Yet the stories of Charles's life, his sufferings, his endurance, his silence, continue to echo through the halls of history. His reign, marked by quiet desperation and slow decline, reminds us that even the most powerful can be fragile. That behind every crown is a human story, filled with hopes, fears, and ultimately, the inescapable truth of mortality. And as Spain turned the page on the Habsburg dynasty, the world waited, watching, wondering what the future would hold for a continent on the brink of transformation. The story of Charles II is not just the story of a king, but the story of countless lives shaped, and sometimes shattered, by the relentless pursuit of dynastic purity. Royal inbreeding was not an accident. It was a deliberate strategy, repeated for generations, designed to preserve bloodlines, consolidate power, and keep kingdoms united. Yet, this strategy carried a terrible price. From the earliest days of the Habsburg dynasty, marriages were arranged not for love, but for alliances, often between close relatives. Cousins, uncles, nieces, the family tree became a tangled web of genetic closeness. Each union intended to strengthen claims to thrones, territories, and titles, but every child born was a living testament to the risks hidden in this pursuit. The effects of inbreeding were often subtle, creeping quietly into the health of infants, the strength of heirs, and the clarity of minds. In some cases, it produced children who were stillborn or died young. In others, it caused lifelong disabilities that isolated them from court life and public duties. And in the most tragic, it resulted in rulers like Charles II, a man whose body was fragile and whose mind was clouded by illness. Historians have long debated the exact extent of the damage caused by inbreeding in the Habsburg line. But the medical evidence, combined with detailed records and personal letters, paints a disturbing picture. Charles suffered from hydrocephalus, a condition that caused swelling in the brain, and a host of other ailments, epilepsy, difficulty speaking, and severe physical deformities. His jaw was so enlarged that it hindered eating and speaking, a condition now known as Habsburg jaw, which was passed down through generations. The psychological impact was equally profound. Isolated from his peers and burdened by his physical frailty, Charles grew up in a world that was both protective and confining. Court life, with its endless ceremonies and political intrigue, offered little relief. He was often the subject of pity, fear, and rumor, a king trapped not just by his crown, but by his body. But Charles was not alone in this suffering. His ancestors, too, had faced the consequences. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also closely related. The pattern repeated itself through generations, a relentless cycle that prioritized lineage over health. Every child born carried the genetic weight of that history. Yet, the people around Charles rarely questioned the practice. It was accepted as the natural order of things, woven into the fabric of aristocratic life. The consequences were hidden behind closed doors, tucked away in the silence of palace chambers and whispered conversations. No one dared challenge the sacredness of royal blood. This silence extended to the women of the court, many of whom bore the physical and emotional burden of this system. Queens and princesses were often expected to produce heirs regardless of the risks. Their health, their happiness, their very lives were secondary to the imperative of succession. The pressure was immense, and the consequences, often tragic. The children born of these unions carried their own stories of struggle. Some lived long lives, but with chronic illnesses or disabilities. Others died young, their potential extinguished before it could bloom. Their fates were reminders of the fragility beneath the grandeur. Charles II's life, more than any other, exposed the human cost of this relentless pursuit. His reign was marked by a series of failed health crises, desperate attempts at cures, and political instability fueled by his incapacity to produce an heir. The kingdom itself suffered under the weight of these challenges. The physical deformities that plagued Charles also had symbolic resonance. His Habsburg jaw became an emblem of the dynasty's decline, a visible mark of the costs of obsession with purity. Artists and writers of the time often portrayed him with a mixture of sympathy and mockery, further isolating the king. Yet behind the caricatures was a man who endured unimaginable pain and isolation. Charles's suffering was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. He was raised in a court that demanded perfection, but he was born broken. The gulf between expectation and reality created a loneliness few could understand. This chapter in history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, tradition, and human cost. It challenges the idea that royal blood is a blessing, revealing instead the curse that can come from valuing lineage above life. The story of Charles II is a warning, a caution against the dangers of placing heritage above humanity. Despite the tragedy, the legacy of these centuries of inbreeding did not disappear overnight. Even after Charles's death, royal families across Europe continued to marry within their circles, though slowly, attitudes began to shift. Scientific understanding of genetics was centuries away, but the visible consequences of such unions could no longer be ignored. The tale of Charles II also opens a window into the lives of those around him, the courtiers, physicians, family members, who witnessed his decline with helplessness or indifference. Their letters and memoirs reveal a world struggling to cope with a monarch who was both king and patient, ruler and victim. In the end, Charles's story is not just about one man or one dynasty. It is about the fragile intersection of human biology and the ambitions of power. It reminds us that behind every crown is a human body, vulnerable, fallible, and subject to the same laws of nature as any other. As we reflect on this chapter, we see how history is shaped not only by battles and treaties, but by the quiet tragedies that unfold behind palace walls. The story of royal inbreeding is one of those tragedies, a somber reminder of the cost of legacy, the weight of expectation, and the human price of power. The death of Charles II marked not only the end of a life steeped in suffering but also the collapse of a vast empire teetering on the edge of chaos. His passing in 1700 was a turning point, a moment when centuries of Habsburg ambition, sacrifice, and tragedy converged into a single, shattering event. The fate of Europe itself hung in the balance. For decades, the question of succession had cast a shadow over the Spanish throne. Charles had no children, no heirs to carry on the family name or secure the future of the empire. His health had long been fragile, his mind clouded by illness. The kingdom waited in anxious silence, aware that his death would unleash a storm unlike any other. The Habsburg dynasty had once ruled an empire that spanned continents, from the rich cities of Italy to the vast colonies of the Americas, from the Netherlands to the deserts of North Africa. But by the time Charles came to the throne, that empire was showing signs of straying. Wars, economic troubles, and internal rivalries had weakened its foundations. Now, without an heir, the future looked uncertain. Europe's great powers saw opportunity in this uncertainty. The death of Charles II threatened to upset the fragile balance of power that had been carefully maintained through alliances and treaties. France, England, Austria, and others prepared to assert their claims, each hoping to gain from the coming void. The question of who would inherit Spain's throne was more than a matter of family pride, it was a question of global strategy. Control of Spain's territories meant access to trade routes, military strength, and political influence. It meant dominance over a world still expanding into new continents and oceans. Charles II's last will attempted to solve this dilemma. In it, he named Philip of Anjou, a grandson of the French King Louis XIV, as his successor. This decision was controversial. It promised to unite the Spanish and French crowns, a prospect that terrified many in Europe who feared the rise of an overwhelmingly powerful alliance. The will sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that engulfed much of Europe for over a decade. Armies clashed across battlefields stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the heart of Germany. Thousands of lives were lost, and entire regions were devastated in the name of dynastic ambition. Yet amid the violence and turmoil, the human stories often went untold. Charles's death was not just a political event, It was the final chapter of a tragic life, one marked by isolation, pain, and the crushing weight of expectation. His passing was mourned quietly by those who had cared for him, even as the world outside prepared for war. The fall of the Habsburgs also meant the end of an era, the conclusion of a dynasty that had shaped European history for centuries. Their legacy was a complex one, achievements in art, science, and governance shadowed by the costs of inbreeding, political intrigue, and conflict. As Europe adjusted to the new reality, the lessons of Charles II's life and death lingered in whispered warnings. The dangers of absolute power, the fragility of human bodies, and the consequences of blind ambition were all laid bare. History moved forward, but the scars remained. The succession crisis also changed the way monarchies viewed marriage and lineage. Slowly, the importance of genetic health began to be recognized, even if the science was still primitive. The rigid insistence on royal bloodlines gave way to more pragmatic considerations, though old habits died hard. For Spain, the war brought devastation and decline. Its empire would never again hold the same power it once commanded. But the story of Charles II and the Habsburgs remained a poignant reminder of the costs behind those lost glories. Today, the tale of Charles II is studied not only for its political significance but also as a deeply human story. It is a story of a man born into greatness but trapped by fate, a king whose reign reflected the triumphs and tragedies of his dynasty. As we reflect on this chapter, we understand that history is more than dates and battles. It is about people, their hopes, their failures, and the ways their lives ripple through time. The fall of Charles II and the end of the Habsburg era is one such ripple, still felt centuries later. The death of Charles II did not simply close the final chapter of a troubled life. It opened a new one for Europe and the world, one shaped by the echoes of his reign and the lessons history would carry forward. His story, a mixture of personal suffering, dynastic collapse, and geopolitical upheaval, reminds us how the fate of one man could influence centuries, and how history is often written in the quiet tragedy behind the grand events. The Habsburg dynasty, with all its power and prestige, was a fragile thing. For generations, royal families had practiced intermarriage in pursuit of political alliances and the preservation of pure bloodlines. But this quest came with unforeseen consequences. Congenital disabilities, mental illness, and physical frailty became an inherited curse passed down through centuries. Charles II's tragic health problems were a culmination of this pattern, a grim symbol of the dangers of genetic isolation. Yet Charles's life also reflects the human side of history, not the kings and battles, but the quiet moments of pain, hope, and endurance. He lived most of his life under watchful eyes, often isolated, yet carrying the weight of a vast empire. He was, in many ways, a prisoner of his birthright, trapped by expectations and the unforgiving rules of royal duty. After his death, Europe's map was redrawn in ways that still resonate. The War of Spanish Succession reshaped alliances, ushered in new powers, and laid groundwork for the modern nation-state system. The Bourbon dynasty took control of Spain, but the echoes of Habsburg rule lingered in architecture, culture, and the collective memory of the people. Charles II's story also forced rulers and scientists to reconsider marriage politics. Slowly, royal families began marrying outside the narrow circle of relatives. While political alliances remained important, the disastrous consequences of inbreeding could no longer be ignored. This shift was subtle and gradual but crucial, laying the foundations for more diverse and healthier royal lineages in the centuries to come. The king's life and death have inspired countless works of art, literature, and scholarly study. His physical and mental struggles, once sources of shame or gossip, are now examined with compassion and medical curiosity. Modern genetics and history combine to tell a fuller story, one that honors the complexities of human life behind the crown. Despite his challenges, Charles II's reign was not without moments of significance. His patronage of the arts and architecture contributed to Spain's rich cultural heritage. He navigated political crises with varying success, attempting to maintain peace and stability in a fractured Europe. In his own way, he shaped the destiny of a continent. The lessons of Charles II's life resonate beyond history books. They remind us of the costs of power untempered by wisdom, of the human toll behind political ambition. They warn against the dangers of isolation, genetic, social, and emotional, and encourage us to consider the long-term consequences of our choices. For Spain, the end of the Habsburg line marked the beginning of a new era. The empire would contract, its influence wane, but its cultural contributions remained. The architecture, art, and traditions from that time continue to influence Spanish identity today, a legacy intertwined with both glory and tragedy. Charles II's story also offers insight into how societies treat their vulnerable members. His physical and mental health challenges were often hidden or misunderstood, a reminder of how stigma can shape lives. Today, as we study his history, there is a growing effort to understand and empathize with those who face similar challenges. In the broader sweep of history, Charles II's reign serves as a cautionary tale and a poignant human story. It illustrates the fragility of power, the complexity of legacy, and the intertwining of personal and political fate. His life, marked by suffering and symbolized by his monstrous birth defects, reminds us that history is never just about triumph or defeat, it is about the people caught in between. As we conclude the series, it is worth reflecting on the enduring impact of these histories. They shape not only how we understand the past but how we approach the future. The stories of kings and queens, of dynasties rising and falling, are reflections of human nature itself, ambitious, flawed, resilient, and endlessly fascinating. The tale of Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, will continue to captivate and educate. It calls us to look deeper, beyond headlines and dates, to the lives lived beneath the surface. In that, there is a timeless lesson about empathy, history, and the intricate dance between power and vulnerability. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most tragic reigns. If you found value in these stories, please subscribe and stay with us for more deep dives into the forgotten past. Stories that bring history to life, one human tale at a time. Now, as you settle in for rest, let these memories fade gently, carried on the quiet winds of time. And so, the tale fades. Not with thunder, but with silence. The royal halls have emptied. The chains have rusted. And the voices of those forgotten now rest. History doesn't always scream its truths. Sometimes it only whispers, softly, through old pages and broken stones. Thank you for being here tonight. For listening. For remembering. If your eyes are still open, let them close. If your mind is still awake, let it wander gently. You're safe now. You're warm. You're not alone. Let the crackling fire take over. Let the quiet sounds of the past carry you into rest. Good night. And may sleep come easily.